Hey, this is Eric with Happy Politics. It's September 28th. We got a full pilot for you guys today. First of all, we're going to be covering Tom Price back in the news again. Trump administration. Come on, guys. We pretty much know how this train goes every single day. The CEO of Equifax has actually stepped down, and Elizabeth Warren has some very let's say some nice comments to say about that. And the Supreme Court has a case coming up actually where that could deal a potentially pretty bad blow to teachers. Not necessarily, but it could potentially be that way. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with Mr. Tom Price. So this article is actually from Politico. Price took military jets to Europe, Asia, amounting to over $500,000. The White House approved the use of a military aircraft for multinational trips for Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price to Africa and to Europe this spring, and to Asia in the summer at the cost of more than $500,000 to the taxpayers. The overseas trips begin to bring the total cost of the taxpayers of Price travels to more than $1 million since May. Now, this is the same guy who, over the course of the Obama administration, had made some comments about how the Democrats were just out of control with spending, and that also includes comments made directly towards travel expenses. And for me personally, I don't really give a shit about these matters so much, only because of the fact that he commented on it in the first place, that I actually do care about the situation. It's very similar to how a while ago it was reported where the Secret Service budget had ran out to the point where they were contributing several hours of overtime for free to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, all he had to say was just basically, I'm deeply committed to making sure that they have all the resources that they need. But what the fuck does that even mean, dude? Because you tweeted that a long time ago talking about all the trips that Obama was taking. And then when you're in a situation where you basically are doing the same thing, you're just so fucking nonchalant about it. And this is just what irritates me about just the whole Trump administration, is just that they say stuff that is politically expedient towards making themselves look good, and their own administration looks good. And then they do the same thing about it. And then they're just like, well, it's not so bad when we do it, but it's very bad when they do it. And I have no idea how, when some people even defend this person, just like some of these Trump supporters are just so fucking ridiculous, man. I don't know, man. It's so damn crazy. Now, moving on. Equifax CEO had actually stepped down. Now, for anybody, if you've been living under a fucking rock and you have no idea what the hell's going on, I don't know how the hell you did not know about this situation. But apparently there was a big leak. Millions of people's private information was divulged in a leak. And one of the things that ended up happening, of course, is that they ended up giving out free credit freezes after they eventually were budged into that position. Initially, they were charging people for being able to freeze your credit, despite the fact that a lot of the information was divulged to no fault of the consumers at all. But Equifax still had the audacity to try to charge people initially to freeze their credit. And what will end up happening during this divulging of information is that we could potentially open up a credit account in somebody's name, and Equifax was just like, well, pretty much, yeah, it was we made a boo-boo, but we're still going to charge you to protect your information, even though we should have been doing better on our end. So anyway, this is an article from The Hill. Equifax CEO Richard Smith will collect roughly $90 million in the coming years after he resigned over the company's massive privacy breach. Smith, who announced his retirement on Tuesday, will collect about $72 million this year and $17.9 million in the coming years. The report adds up to about 63 cents for each customer who is potentially exposed in the company's data breach. So basically, and I was having this conversation actually over Twitter with somebody else who was talking about, we can't necessarily be too hard on this guy because, he's the boss. It was somebody in the IT department's fault who was responsible for this breach. And my thoughts were, it really doesn't necessarily even matter as to whether or not it was some other person's fault or not. It's not in my hands to necessarily go out there and chastise somebody who is in a lower position than the leader, the head man, the head honcho of the company. He is the leader of their company. He's supposed to be in a position to where he is overseeing the situation and making sure that they don't happen. And if they do happen, he provides a sort of a remedy in order to make sure that it doesn't necessarily happen in the future. And the way that Equifax just sort of executed on this decision was just not for the best. In fact, like a lot of what ended up happening, pretty much virtually all of it, was only due to the pushback. If nobody said anything, if nobody did anything to Equifax, you wouldn't have a situation where people could freeze their credits. You wouldn't have a situation where there's another story that came up a little while later on that they're now announcing that the consumers will now be able to lock their file on demand, which is a free feature they'll be bringing along in January. You wouldn't necessarily have anything like that. These people wouldn't give a fuck about that if they didn't have any kind of pushback. So without any kind of regulatory body overseeing them, then these corporations will pretty much think that they'll get away with anything. But speaking of a regulatory body, Elizabeth Warren had some comments actually about when he was stepping down. And what she had to say was, "I've called for the Equifax executives to be held accountable for their role in failing to stop this breach and hiding it from the public for 40 days, which is a very fucking long time. It is not really accountable. It's not real accountability if the CEO resigns without giving back a nickel in pay and without publicly answering the questions." And this is what part of my rub is. Me as a regular everyday person, a Joe Smo or whatever the fuck you want to call it as, if I do a shitty job, I get fired for it. And if I try to get a severance package or something to get some kind of payout, they're going to fucking laugh at me all the way out throughout the fucking door. They're not going to do anything for me. But this guy, he gets fired or let go, retired, however way you want to put it. And he walks away with millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. What is that telling everybody? That it sends the signal that, there's no accountability whatsoever, that these guys get paid for a shitty job. He's just a figurehead. He's nobody. I mean, what are these people? They're just rich assholes who just do virtually whatever the hell that they want. They take over these corporations. They'll run it how they see fit, make some money. And when they make a oopsie, oops, I'll just take my money and then leave, and then nobody will do anything to me. And then I'll just probably go to another corporation or just continue making money in some other kind of way. This is basically what happens. And but you know what? There's a light at the end of the tunnel, because Miss Warren, and I know this is a kind of an old story, but she did actually propose an Equifax bill where basically it would give consumers the ability to freeze their credit for free. Now, under a Trump administration, I don't necessarily think that this particular legislation would actually pass. I am hopeful it will. But I probably would just save this for potentially in 2018. I would highly recommend that people just sort of keep their eye out for it. Elizabeth Warren has made some questionable choices in the past, but I am very, very hopeful that she'll come around when 2018 comes. 2018 is about, and we're having all these elections going on. Now, the final story of the day that I'm going to be covering. Now, this is a story from the LA Times. The Supreme Court is poised to deal a sharp blow to the unions that represent millions of teachers and other public employees, announcing Thursday that it will consider striking down the mandatory fees that support collective bargaining. The justices will hear the case of Mark Janus, an Illinois state employee who is objecting to paying fees to a union, which represents 35,000 state workers. The decision, due by next June, could prove a costly setback to public sector unions in 22 states, including Carolina, where such fees are authorized by law. Labor experts have predicted that a significant percentage of employees would stop supporting their union if given a choice. The other 28 states have the right of work laws that forbid requiring workers to join or support a union. Now, the argument that is actually being presented by Mark Janus in this particular case is that he is appealing the lower court ruling that rejected his claim that such fees violate his free speech rights under the U.S. Constitution. Now, what is being stated by the union is actually these powerful interests want to gut the last remaining checks on their control, a strong and united labor movement that fights for equity and opportunity for all, not just the privileged few. And this was stated by the AFT president, the American Federation of Teachers, that is the union that is also a part of this case. Okay, so I think actually what Mark Janice is referring to is a previous Supreme Court case that actually happened several years ago. He's talking about in campaign finance laws when it comes to money equals free speech. And I know that I think another person had actually brought up some pretty good points. Kyle Kalinske from Secular Talk had made some excellent points about this, where in his mind he's sort of viewing the situation as though he should be entitled to make free speech as though it equals money. So if he contributes to this union, he's feeling like he is supporting the union, where he also feels like if he doesn't necessarily have to contribute to the union, he can also just deal directly with the corporation. He should be able to, in the vacuum of that argument, he is stating that money should equal free speech, and that is not necessarily the case, because you can then virtually argue that point for pretty much anything. Whereas, if I contribute some money to, I don't know, some drugs or sexual services or something like that, then that should be the equivalent of free speech, and it shouldn't be a crime. I can potentially set up a bounty on somebody and request that they be killed, and that should be the equivalent of free speech. That's not a crime. It's all good. I shouldn't be held accountable for my actions. So I don't think that actually works. But I also have a big problem with people who don't necessarily understand the contributions that are made for unions. So they like to bring up the point where they don't necessarily feel as though like they're put in a situation where they're given a choice to be able to join the union or not. And I'll bring up an argument that actually has been done, and this is actually during the Carter v. Carter case. Now, as stated, the effect in which, in respect to wages and hours, is subject to the dissentient minority, to the will of the stated majority. To accept in these circumstances is not to exercise a choice, but to surrender to force. The power conferred upon the majority is, in effect, the power to regulate the affairs of the unwilling minority. This is the legislative delegation is in the most obnoxious form, for it's not even delegation to an official or an official body, to the private persons. A statute to which limits or confers the power that undertakes as intolerable or is unconstitutional interference with a personal liberty and private property. The delegation is so clearly arbitrary and so clearly a denial of rights safeguarded by the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment, and it is unnecessary to do more than to refer to the decisions of this court which foreclosed the question. Now, this is actually an argument in favor of the right to work laws. And here's what I have a problem with this situation. So what they're stating is that the decisions that are made by the majority, to which this is a collective bargaining, is therefore overriding the decision making of the minority. Except, and he also brings up a point later on where he's talking about, and I'm trying to make sure that under these circumstances is not to exercise a choice, but to surrender to force. Now, it doesn't necessarily matter whether or not the union was actually there in the first place. There are a set of circumstances that you would have to adhere to, regardless of whether or not the union was there in the first place. So if a union was not present there to be able to, for you to participate in collective bargaining, you would be subject to being forced to negotiate your wages directly with a corporation. Corporation which, depending upon who we're talking about, employs hundreds to thousands and potentially, I don't know, maybe millions. I don't think there's a real corporation necessarily that big. Well, there probably are a few, and it puts you in a very lose-lose situation where now, instead of you having the backing of a huge collective of people and a huge monetary source to which you draw from, and people who are looking out for the rights of you, to which you are claiming that you're saying that you are a minority, you are then saying that as a minority your rights are being trampled on. And actually what the union does is the exact opposite of it. The union is actually a representative of you in order to fight these corporations, because they are aware that these corporations have a huge pool of money and resources and a lot of legal power to be able to push virtually whatever the fuck they want. And you as a minority don't necessarily have those same resources, but you're equivocating them as if they are the same. So while you're saying that you are a minority and your rights are being trampled on, it's actually the opposite. They're actually working on the behalf of you to bring about better, higher wages and better labor laws for you. So I don't necessarily buy that argument. That the way it's framed is those that it's not necessarily giving you a choice. There is actually a choice in a situation. The other choice is that if you decide to reject the union protections, then unfortunately you are on your own, subject to whatever the whims of whatever fucking corporation that you are working with, be it FedEx or I don't know, TI or whatever, and they decide to act one way or another on you. You don't have any protections because you decide to negotiate with the corporations. And what the hell are you going to do? You're going to fight in court for years upon legal battles with them. You don't have that kind of backing. And this is the point of what a union is all about. It is to fight on the behalf of the minority, but you're framing it as though they are overriding the rights of a minority when they are in fact fighting for the minority. Now, I am a little bit wary though about this case in some parts because it was also reported that Gorsuch is also scheduled to speak at a conservative group at the Trump International Hotel, and progressive groups are intended to protest this appearance. Now, the judicial branch is supposed to, in practice, act separately from the Trump administration. So the fact that Gorsuch is still this tightly wound into the Trump administration, it gives me the idea that there is some huge political underpinnings that are going on around here that I don't necessarily feel very comfortable with. I hope that in part that whoever is listening to this takes into consideration my arguments and takes it to the case, and hopefully we were able to protect the union laws actually for those teachers out there.